years, spending over 6 years working as the women's correspondent there. I was the first and only person to have this job title at a UK news outlet, and I spent my time in the role exploring national news and global stories from a woman's angle. But I've recently-ish left to go freelance, and now I'm freelance. I've written for a range of other publications. But anyway, enough about me. We're here today to discuss the gender wealth gap. This isn't an area you hear a lot about in the media or in wider discourse more generally. Instead, it is the gender pay gap, which gets a lot more attention. But the findings of this new research from Women's Budget Group are shocking and deserve conversation and attention. So, new analysis of the Wealth and Assets Survey by the Women's Budget Group has found the gender wealth gap is currently 21% in comparison to 13% for the gender pay gap. A key point which the report hones in on is the fact that the majority of men's wealth comes from their pensions, whereas for women's wealth, it comes from their share of jointly owned assets. The Women's Budget Group is demanding that we reform tax relief on private pensions and that we roll out a 2% tax on wealth, as is proposed by Tax Justice UK. So now I'm going to introduce our brilliant panelists. Thank you so much for being here today. So first we have Ignacia Pinto, sorry, Senior Research and Policy Officer at Women's Budget Group, who is the report author, and Dr. Daniela Jenkins, who is the Senior Lecturer at the Centre for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, which is based at the University of Bristol. And last but not least, we have Caitlin Boswell, who is the Head of Advocacy and Policy at Tax Justice UK. So first, we're going to start with a report I outlined from Ignacia. So thank you, Ignacia. I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks, Mayan. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I'm Ignacia Pinto, Senior Research and Policy Officer at the Women's Budget Group, and I'm going to share the main results from the report. Okay, so I hope you can see my slides. I wanted to start saying thanks to 30 Percy Foundation for giving us funding for this report and very important support. So what you will see in this report and in the presentation first, an analysis of the Wealth and Asset Survey, which is a survey conducted by the ONS, and the latest round covers 2020 to 2022. And we're going to see average wealth for men and women, different type of wealth, differences across age, and in the report we also have information for households. And the second part, I'm going to talk about why taxation of wealth is a feminist issue, the role of taxes for gender equality in general, why do we need taxation of wealth, and some policy proposals. So first of all, in the UK, well, inequality, sorry, let me, so wealth inequality has increased in the last 30 years. This is a global phenomenon, but it's also happening in the UK. In 2029, the wealthiest 10% held 51.4% of total wealth, around half. But in 2023, for the latest year that we have data, that share increased to 27% of total wealth. And there's a lot of discussion, or it's more known, the income inequality. But the thing is that wealth is even more concentrated than income. And we have that the wealthiest 10% hold 57% of total wealth. But if we see those at the top percent of the income distribution, a different measure, they receive 36% of total income. So definitely wealth is more concentrated than income. So let's move on to the results of the report. What we found in general is that men in the UK hold substantially more wealth than women, largely because of pension ownership differences and how wealth is accumulated over time. This is something that the Women's Budget Group always highlights, that the unequal distribution of unpaid care and other inequalities meant that women have fewer opportunities to accumulate wealth. And why is that? One of the reasons is, on average, because of caring responsibilities, they earn less. They're also more likely to work part-time or have low-paid jobs, take career breaks to take care of their children or other family members. And that means that their earnings are, on average, lower than men. And also something important that we've found is, as Maya said, that for men, a greater proportion of their wealth comes from private pension and financial wealth, which is mostly individual. But for women, this survey shows that the majority comes from physical and property wealth, which is assumed to be shared with other members. So it's not the same when you are like the solely owner of your wealth, when if you're a man, versus women, that it's something that it's shared with others and you don't have complete control. I'm gonna talk a bit more about that later. So average wealth for men and women. Men, as you see there, hold 378,000 pounds on average, versus women, which is around 300,000 pounds, with a gap of 21%. And in the table here, you can see that this like total wealth has different components, including pension wealth, private pension wealth. And there's where the gap is even bigger. It's 43%. For financial wealth, 23%. And interestingly, we see that for physical wealth and property wealth, on average, women have slightly more wealth. But again, this is something that's shared. So it's the same for everyone in the household. And the difference is just like 1%. So it's relatively small with the other measures. So now looking at different age groups, because wealth accumulation, it's very close to what happens over time. And I think it's very interesting to see that for the younger group, 20 to 29, there's almost no wealth gap. But then as people start to grow older, the gap increases. And this is very and closely related to the moment when women start having children, reaching 25% for those between 60 to 69 years old. So let's talk a little bit about the details of this survey. What do we mean with total wealth, or what the Wealth and Assets Survey mean? It's the sum of property wealth, physical wealth. Well, property wealth is the main home. Physical wealth is vehicles and everything that is inside the household. Financial wealth, savings accounts, shares, and all. Yeah, like if you have an ISA, that will be in financial wealth, current accounts. and private pension wealth, both from defined contribution schemes and defined benefit schemes. So this survey has information at the person level and at the household level. And when we're doing gender analysis, what we would like to see is the information at the person level. But the only exclusive individual data that we have is from pension wealth, actually. That's why it's very important to look at the gap between men and women there. Financial wealth also has a big component of individual data, most of it, but there are some shared savings accounts, for example. But yeah, definitely financial wealth and pension wealth, we can say that the person has more control over them. What happens with property wealth and physical wealth? This survey takes all the household members over 16 years old and divides the value among them. This might or not represent the reality, because if there's a couple with children, probably as 17 years old, it's not going to have a part of the mortgage. But in many times, couples, when they buy a home, that's shared. But we don't have that detail in the data. So that's why we need to have this consideration when looking at different types of wealth. So here, looking at the average wealth for men and women, we can see that, as I said, women rely more on wealth that is shared and also more difficult to liquidate. If you have a savings account or shares, you just go and sell them and access your money. But if part of your wealth is from the house that's shared with someone else, it's not that easy to access those assets or resources. So this leaves them in a more precarious position than men, who have greater control over their wealth. And the sum of pension and financial wealth for women is 43%, and for men 55%, so over half. And we see that pension wealth, it's a big chunk of men's wealth. And this type of wealth also increases with age. And again, we have a very, very small gap for those from 20 to 29 years old, but it just increases over time, just reflecting differences in earnings throughout men's and women's life cycles. The report has more information. I invite you to read it, but I think this is the highlights. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about why taxation of wealth is a feminist issue. First, why do we need taxation of wealth? First of all, in the UK, there's no direct tax on wealth. And the kind of wealth tax that we have, like the capital gains tax that applies for dividend and capital gains, it's lower. The average rate is lower than income that taxes for that income tax. So then we see that there's an under taxation of income from wealth versus income from work. And this under taxation is concerning from a gender perspective for two main reasons. The first, fewer tax revenues means that we have less fiscal space. So there's an opportunity cost, because we're missing out on investment in public services and social security that can contribute to gender equality and the well-being of the society in general, not only for women. But also because wealth generates wealth. So under taxation of wealth fuels wealth inequality, including gender wealth inequality. So as long as we don't tax wealth, we can only expect the wealth inequality to increase, really. But what could be done about it? There are a number of options available to the government for taxing wealth. We have Caitlin Boswell from Tax Justice UK, and they propose 10 reforms to raise up to 60 billion per year, including a 2% annual tax on assets over 10 million pounds, which could raise 24 billion per year. And it's very good and interesting to see that there is public support for a tax like this one. For example, 77% of people in Great Britain support increasing taxes on the very richest, rather than cut public spending to improve public finances. And a survey from Patriotic Millionaires UK shows that 80% of millionaires support this 2% tax on wealth over 10 million. And the support is even higher among that actually have more than 10 million, to 85%. So even those that would be affected by this wealth tax are in favor of it. Another proposal is to increase capital gains tax to make it equivalent to income tax and close loopholes, and that would raise around 12 billion pounds per year. And as we saw that there's a big difference in private pension, we are also calling for a reform of pension tax reliefs, which are regressive and benefit higher earners, we are typically men. The cost of the pension tax reliefs in 2022-23 was 48.7 billion pounds. So some of those resources could be used to make pensions more gender equal. So to finalize, we need fair taxation of wealth to fund our public services and social security and advance gender equality. Taxation of wealth is a feminist issue because it would not only help reduce inequality directly, including gender equality, but also generate revenue to fund our public services and a proper social security system. And this would contribute to gender equality and is good for women, but also for the economy and the society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ignacia. Thank you so much. You obviously know this stuff inside out, and congratulations on the report. Yeah, I feel like taxation of wealth, firstly, often isn't seen as a feminist issue, and also it's misconstrued as being deeply unpopular. But as you said, you know, almost 8 in 10 people in this country are in favor of it. But yeah, so now we're going to go to Dr. Daniela Jenkins, and you're going to discuss the gender pension gap. So yeah, thanks again, Ignacia.
Thank you, and thank you, Ignacia, for authoring such a detailed and really provoking report in a number of ways. I'm going to speak about pensions because that's my research area, my special interest. And I think it's important to start out with saying that within the UK, we are living with the consequences of an increasingly financialised pension system. And what this means is that the majority of income that people live on in retirement comes from money invested through private or occupational pension schemes. And as a result, most people in the UK are passive actors in the global financial markets, whether they realise it or not. Now, the other sad truth about the UK pension system is that it's gendered. And by that, I mean that it produces different outcomes for men and women. It's gendered in terms of makeup. So women constitute and have always constituted the majority of pensioners. So when we talk about pensions, we're primarily talking about women, but also it's gendered in terms of outcomes. So we know that women accumulate less pensions wealth across the life course. Now, to give a sense of scale, the DWP released some ad hoc statistical measures this week, and they measured the gender pensions gap for women aged between 55 to 59 between the years of 2020 and 22 at 48%. Now, this represents pensions wealth that's not in payment, and in absolute terms, that sits at around £81,000 for women and £156,000 for men. But importantly, if you include those women who have zero pensions wealth, that gender pensions gap jumps to 62%. But I think it's really important that we recognize that this doesn't just affect older women. There are gender pensions gaps at every single age cohort. So I'm going to let that sink in. From 16 to 24 to 75 plus, wherever you sit within that age spectrum, there's a gender pensions gap. And this speaks to a systemic failing of the pension system, which is so much more than just about childcare. So childcare is part of that, is one of the causal facts, but ultimately we are at risk of essentializing if we just say, oh, well, this is about mothers, this is about maternity in some way, shape or form. And there's this sort of passive acceptance that somehow, well, we can't do anything about who gives birth. But ultimately, the words that I use repeatedly, that this is pernicious and pervasive. It's about replicating and reinforcing gender inequalities in real time and in plain sight. Now, why does this matter? If the purpose of the pension system is to support people financially in old age, what we see is that the current system is failing the most vulnerable, the low paid, people who work part-time. There is a clear relationship between earnings and pension savings levels. Around 48% of those earning between £10,000 to £20,000 per year are saving at minimum levels, compared to just 1 in 10% who are saving at minimum levels of those earning between £60,000 to £70,000. And around 3 in 4 low earners are saving at just the legal minimum level of 8%. We also need to examine the impact on the lowest earners. Roughly 2.5% of private sector employees in 2023 earned less than £10,000 a year. And of those, only a quarter were even saving into a workplace pension at all. Now, why is this a women's issue? Well, 69% of these lowest paid workers are women, and 50% of them work within 3 industries: hospitality, retail, social and healthcare, industries which are characterized by low pay and precarity. So what we see is that high earners, who are more likely to be men, are less likely to rely on pensions in old age, but they also receive more in terms of employer contributions and tax reliefs from the current pension systems. So what are the trends? What's happening here? Ultimately, we are all in this just as much together. While auto-enrollment has increased participation rates, so over the last sort of 10 years, and since actually 2012, more than 10 million people are now in occupational pension schemes who were not there before. But most of those people are only saving at the minimum legal level. And ultimately, this is an open secret across the pensions industry that will not be enough for most people to retire on. We also know that increasingly we need to look at housing wealth. This is a comorbidity. We can no longer assume that everyone will eventually become a homeowner. And so we recognize the fact that a lot of those people who are not gaining pensions wealth also will not have property wealth as well at the point of retirement. And we also need to factor in social inequality and intergenerational wealth. Inheritance, support in getting on the housing ladder, so the bank of mum and dad, as we call it, or even the confidence to navigate the financialized system, equally affect people unequally. So ultimately, if you come from a more advantaged background, you're much more likely to be able to own property, even if you earn less. You're much more likely to have confidence to navigate the financialized system, and you're much more likely to inherit wealth as well. So what can we do about this? Ultimately, there is an imperative for us to make the system more progressive. There are £3.6 trillion of money under assets under management. There is no reason why anyone should be retiring in poverty. There are ways in which we can address this distribution issue. Tax reliefs on pension contributions are essentially a kickback for the rich and need to be re-examined. I would personally argue that we also need to look at this in conjunction with inheritance tax, particularly as this will affect millennial and Gen Z age populations significantly in terms of increasing financial inequalities in the future. We need to challenge assumptions about housing wealth and how this interacts with pensions, recognizing that there will be a growing proportion of lifetime renters. And what does that mean for them in terms of pensions as wealth? We should also look at contributions to pensions in terms of employer contributions, and that's government-backed credits for unpaid work, or whether that's redistributing employer contributions towards those that need them the most. More broadly, though, we need to examine where this wealth is coming from, and that there needs to be greater accountability through pension schemes beyond investment returns as we find ourselves all as stakeholders within a system which is not currently serving us well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniela. That was amazing. You've made what is, often seen as this quite kind of impenetrable, complex issue. People think I just don't understand the pension gender gap, but you've made it, very clear for people. So now, if we can go over to Caitlin, that would be brilliant.
Thanks very much. Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me to the Women's Budget Group. It's been really brilliant to see this important and timely report, which highlights very kind of sobering realities. And just wanted to say a big thank you to Women's Budget Group for amplifying our policy asks in there and inviting us to speak today. So I'm going to talk a bit more about some of the tax proposals and why now is the moment that we and many others are calling for a wealth tax. So as has already been mentioned here, but I just want to emphasize the fact that we really do see tax as a tool for achieving social justice. So whether that's feminist, disability, racial justice, or climate justice, the thing that I enjoy the most about working and campaigning around tax reform is how it can be used as a tool to achieve these goals and to create the kind of society that we want to see. Progressive tax reform, first and foremost, provides a solution to the often asked question and blocker: how are we going to pay for this? How are we going to pay to make these the things that we want to see a reality? So it raises vital revenue to fund public services that women and other marginalised groups are more likely to rely on, like the NHS, childcare, education, and social care. Women are also more likely to work within them, and be hardest hit when services are cut or scaled back. So investing in public services not only responds to women's needs, but also supports their ability to participate in the workforce, making it a key step towards reducing economic gender inequality. But crucially, through taxing wealth more, it's not just about raising much needed money, which is obviously important, but it's also about creating a fairer and more equal system, which reduces inequality in the long term through redistributing wealth more equitably across society. So, yeah, why a wealth tax and why now? People across the UK recognise that something drastically needs to change. 14 years of austerity have left our public services at breaking point. An ongoing cost of living crisis is making life harder for all of us, particularly women and other marginalised communities, and the impacts of the climate emergency are making themselves ever more visible here in the UK. More people than ever are reliant on food aid, and wages don't pay enough for the majority to do more than scrape by and survive. And we have a government which seems more interested in stripping away support from the most marginalised, like disabled people, than making the super rich pay a little bit more to benefit everyone. At the same time as this, the wealth of the super rich is growing. So we saw in the Sunday Times Rich List just last month that the UK now has 165 billionaires, and fewer than 50 families own more wealth than 30 million people in the UK, which is a really shocking statistic. And it can be quite difficult to comprehend the scale of this wealth that we're talking about. But if you were to spend £1,000 a day, it would take 2,740 years to spend £1 billion. So much longer than any of us will be around. It's an obscene amount of wealth. This disparity of wealth is economically destabilizing. It pushes thousands more into poverty. It undermines economic growth, and it's proving fertile ground for the dangerous rise of right-wing populism. But we believe that it doesn't have to be this way. So the money is there. The UK is the sixth richest country in the world, but because of the way our tax system is designed, being littered with unfair loopholes and reliefs and taxing income from work at a much higher rate than income from wealth, this wealth is trapped in the hands of an ever shrinking number of people at the top. As a result, the rich get richer at a faster rate, which fuels and entrenches inequality. But as we've heard, we know that growing numbers of voices and people are supportive of and calling for a wealth tax. We're really seeing this have a moment, and momentum is massively building, which is really exciting to see. That includes the public, MPs, unions, economists, and millionaires themselves. As well as the polling that was mentioned earlier, there was another recent poll that found that 75% of the public supports a wealth tax, and that's regardless of political persuasion. So people across the political spectrum recognize something needs to be changed in order to deliver the transformational change that our society needs to see. So in terms of what we're calling for at Tax Justice, in partnership with Patriotic Millionaires UK, who are a membership organisation of UK millionaires calling to be taxed more and calling for a wealth tax, we've outlined 10 reforms which would take steps to tax wealth more and raise a significant £60 billion a year. To put that in perspective, that's around it's around almost 20 times what the government was planning to cut away from disabled people's life-saving support, and it reminds us that cuts are always a political choice. So our key ask that we've heard about is a wealth tax. So we're calling for an annual 2% tax on wealth exceeding 10 million. So that means that it would only apply to the amount of wealth above the 10 million threshold. And the reason that we have gone for a proposal that sets it at this high threshold is because it ensures that it would only impact the super rich, and it would only impact a small number of people, around 20,000 people, or just 0.03% of the population, which is the size of the O2 Arena. So that would make it easier to administer for HMRC, ensure that it only affects people who have a real diversity of assets and wealth, but at the same time raising significant funds for our communities. Beyond the wealth tax, so while this is a big focus of our campaigning, it's not everything we're calling for, and there are many other ways the government could take steps to improve existing taxes or tax wealth more in smaller ways through closing loopholes or making the system fairer. So one of those is, as we heard from Ignazia, reforming capital gains tax, so equalising capital gains tax rates with income tax and closing unfair loopholes in the system, such as the death uplift, and introducing an exit tax. That would raise an additional £14 billion a year and equalise the way we treat income from wealth and work. Then we are also calling to apply national insurance to investment income, which would raise an extra 10 billion a year. So currently, national insurance is paid on income from work, but not income from investments such as dividends from shares, rent from property, or interest on savings. That creates a really unfair situation where landlords who don't have a mortgage, earning huge sums of money during a housing crisis, are paying a lower rate of tax than their renters whose only income is from their job. And another set of asks that we have and policy recommendations are around making the biggest and richest polluters pay. So one of these involves ending and redirecting subsidies that currently exist, subsidies to harmful fossil fuel companies, and taxing private jets more, which would raise around an extra 3 billion a year. I can share our policy briefing that outlines all of these asks in a lot more depth, but I would end on just saying that it's important to remember that while taxing wealth more and progressive tax reform is a crucial tool and first step for building a more fair and equal society, We believe that we also have to go further and tackle the roots of inequality, such as sexism, racism, and all other forms of discrimination. Otherwise, the super rich will continue to get richer at the expense of everyone else. So we have an ever-growing movement of players, of voices, of people, of groups coming together to call on the government to tax the rich more, to build the kind of society that we want to see. And we have over 60,000 supporters at Tax Justice UK. So if you're interested in any of this, please do visit our website and sign up, and you can join the movement for tax justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caitlin, and all the speakers. You've been fantastic. You've all made very important and interesting points, and congratulations to Women's Budget Group for producing such a fantastic report. I wanted to end by saying that we are, of course, living through very turbulent and very tough times. As Caitlin has just said, wealth inequality is surging. We are living in an age where the rich are getting richer and richer, and the poor, as a result, are effectively getting poorer. Wealth inequality has massively gone up since the 1990s, as we've heard, both here in the UK and also globally. And women are being very hard hit by this, as well as other marginalised groups. How we are in a situation where the wealthiest 10% living in the UK now own as much as 57% of total wealth, is beyond me in some ways. And how things can have got so much worse in my lifetime. I was born in 1991, is also just mind-boggling. And also we've just seen, so many of these forces just really spilling over and getting worse, in the last year, in 2025. So I'm going to read some words from the executive summary of the report. So, increasing wealth inequality limits social mobility, undermines democracy, social cohesion, productivity, and growth. Wealth inequality also has a gender dimension, with men holding considerably more wealth than women. So, as I've said, I totally agree with the idea that taxation of wealth is a feminist issue, something which the report clearly states. As the report says, this is because taxation of wealth would not just spawn revenue to fund public services and a proper social security system, which of course women are more reliant on, but also to curb wealth inequality directly, with this obviously helping to tackle gender wealth inequality. And as we've said, taxation of wealth is a popular idea, even though it's often misconstrued as not being. But to return to the issue of gender inequality, this problem can't be looked at in a vacuum. We are witnessing an explosion of misogyny, but not just misogyny, also just bigoted views more broadly around the world. And we're seeing an aggressive, explicit backlash to feminism, with hard-earned rights women and people of marginalised genders took for granted, ruthlessly ripped away from them. So a more progressive taxation system could truly help to solve a lot of problems we are currently facing here in the UK. For me, a core barrier to tackling these issues is galvanising political will among those in Westminster, but also making these issues real and tangible to the British public. So I'm just going to end by summarising some of the driving issues behind gender inequality in the UK, which we've touched upon. For me, it's rooted in pay discrimination, but also absurdly high childcare costs, which push women into cutting down their hours or just withdrawing from the workplace altogether. Another driving factor would be women being more likely to take on the burden of unpaid care for children or for sick or for elderly loved ones, but also women being radically overrepresented, as we've heard, in low paid, precarious types of work, many of which involve 0 hours contracts, whether that's healthcare, hospitality, admin, retail, cleaning, and care work. But also the fact that women are underrepresented in the highest paid types of work and less likely to be in the top jobs in a whole broad range of professions. And finally, the fact women in the highest paid jobs are often paid less than their male counterparts or even male colleagues in more junior positions. But yet again, yeah, as I've said, these issues remain confusing for so many people out there. I think there's a problem that sometimes they're not talked about in the most accessible way. And also these issues are being twisted and warped by the populist right as we speak. So yeah, thanks again for all the fantastic speakers. You've been brilliant. And thanks to everyone for joining this webinar. Now we're going to open up to the audience for 15 minutes of questions. So I'm just waiting to see what the questions are. Oh, we've got quite a few questions. So one from Jackie Henley. When you say gendered wealth, do you mean wealth by biological sex, or was this data not captured? So is this one for Ignacia?
Yes, yeah, I can take that. So basically we use the data from the ONS, from the survey, which is the variable that you see in the database. Sorry for the boring question, but the variable is sex, and that it's a self-declared information. And that's the information that we have. And in the report, we speak about gender because we understand there are system and structures of inequality based on gender. That's why we more widely talk about the gender wealth gap. But the information is from the data, which is self-declared, and it's sex.
Thank you so much. And then we've got, yeah, a lot of other questions. So, from Patricia Ball, is there a country with a better, more equal tax system than the UK? So maybe that's one for you, Caitlin.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, fairness is obviously a subjective term. I think globally, though, there is a real under taxation of wealth and inheritance, and most countries sort of draw their tax income around work in the way that the UK does. There are some countries and international examples where they have introduced wealth taxes or forms of taxing wealth more. So currently, three countries have a wealth tax. That's Spain, Norway, and Switzerland. And France, for example, has a tax on certain forms of wealth, such as property. Um, but these are quite different from the type of wealth tax we're calling for in the UK. So, for example, in France and Spain, the wealth taxes are levied on at a much lower threshold, so it impacts a much higher proportion of people. And whereas, as I mentioned, the one that we're calling for here would be at a much higher threshold of 10 million and only impact a small proportion of society, because we felt it was really important that it didn't end up impacting people who potentially could be asset rich and cash poor, and that it would only impact the really super rich who absolutely aren't paying their fair share. But there is a recognition and a need for much better international cooperation more broadly around taxing wealth more and around progressive tax reform. And that's why we and many others are calling for the UK government to get behind and support the UN Tax Convention, which would allow countries to work together globally around progressive tax reform and ensuring that countries receive the tax that they are owed and deserve in order to keep their communities functioning and supported.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. We've got a good question from Rianne Benyon from Maternity Action. I'm sure a lot of you will know the organization. It's a brilliant one. So yeah, Rianne says, I'm reflecting on outdated policy assumptions that wealth will be shared between partners, that people will be employees, not self-employed, that people will have access to occupational schemes or maternity or pensions, etc. Can you say something about these outdated policy assumptions? And how they intersect with the build-up of wealth, including in pensions. So who wants to take that question? Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Daniela.
I don't mind addressing that. And I think, particularly when it comes to pensions, when you look back at it, a lot of the planning assumptions which are used today come from the 1940s, and they kind of reflect a 1940s world. They, assume things like age differences between, man and wife. They assume that man and wife is, or versions of that are the sort of reason for, households. We have absolutely an opaque view of finances within households, and yet we know that pensions wealth is individualized, for example. Yet when we look at wealth on a household basis, we kind of assume that somehow there will be a fair distribution within that. Even there, when we have huge blind spots around things like cohabitation and the sharing of pensions rights for cohabiting couples, for example, who then break up, whether or not they have children. There are no rights to redress. And even where there are rights to redress for things like divorcing couples, for example, we know that a lot of the laws in place are underutilized, partly because the solicitors don't really understand it. So there are lots of assumptions about the ways in which we work, the patterns in which we work, for example. So assumptions that, you'll work for, 40 years for one employer and your salary will go up for the entire time. We know that most people don't work in that way. And yet a lot of the planning assumptions and the models that inform our pension system are still based on that. So many people will know that the government announced a new pensions commission. One of the things that I, for example, will be pushing for is that we challenge those assumptions so that our pension system actually recognizes the ways in which people work, live, have relationships, have children now, rather than basing that on very, very outdated models.
Thank you so much, Daniela.
Yeah, something very quickly. And I think that Con makes the point that it's important women have their own independent income, whether it's pension or from earnings or social security, because we don't know what's going to happen. You might be planning for the best with your partner, but women need their income, their own income to ensure their independence, their freedom and security.
Yeah, agreed. Although obviously, yeah, not always. Yeah, everyone's got a different situation. But is there a political party in the UK who supports tax reform? So, Caitlin, definitely one for you.
Yeah, I mean, we've been quite encouraged to see, well, I would say on the one hand, we've been very disappointed to see the lack of movement on this by the government, although some steps were taken at the October budget to tax wealth more. So that should be said and recognised. So the government closed loopholes in inheritance tax. It took steps to tax private jets more. And for example, adding VAT to private schools. So there were important steps taken, but it does need to go much further to deliver the kind of transformative change that we want to see. In terms of support for a wealth tax, you might have heard this week that the Chancellor sort of refused to rule it out, which we don't know really what that means. But the MPs on the left of the Labour Party, so MPs in the Socialist Campaign Group, in the Green Party, some Lib Dems, and some MPs from the soft to moderate left of the Labour Party are in favour of and calling for a wealth tax and further taxes on wealth. So this has been really encouraging to see, and we're noticing that the more we're getting these announcements of things like cuts to disability welfare, other cuts that people just know that our country can't face, the more MPs are coming out in support of and showing interest and curiosity in wealth taxes, which is good to see. And I think this is going to be the most impactful and kind of promising line of influence with MPs and with the government, is to say taxing wealth is an alternative to cuts, and cuts are a political choice. You have another option, and that seems to be our best kind of framing for influence.
Thank you, Caitlin. Yeah, it must be an exciting time to be at your organisation. We're seeing some movement on this issue. Um, yeah, there was an interesting question from Ed Pybus. So for Ignacia, do you know how many people have no wealth, and are there more women with zero or negative wealth compared to men?
I don't know. but the data is available. So that could be like a follow-up of this report to look at that data. And I wouldn't be surprised that women are overrepresented among those with zero wealth. But yeah, thanks for the suggestion. That's something that we can definitely have a look at.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to know. Um, so many questions, just having a look. Okay, another question from Ed Pybus. Do you also look, this is for Daniela, do you also look at entitlement to state pension? I imagine there are many more women than men who won't have sufficient national insurance contributions to receive the full state pension.
Yes, so this is equal an issue. Obviously, we're talking about pensions and wealth today, so that's about private pensions. But state pensions are also gendered, so they're based on proxy employment, paid employment patterns as well, in terms of things like national insurance contributions. So we know that many women, if they take time out, we know that there are issues around things like child benefit, for example. So once there were changes to child benefit, there are some women who are not getting that time that they're spending credited in, so they don't even realize that now. And also freelancers. So if people are working for themselves, they may not, for example, be paying in national contributions for themselves if they're kind of effectively paying themselves under the kind of minimum wage threshold, for example. So there are lots of patterns that we can see which are also affecting state pensions contributions as well as affecting private pensions contributions and occupational pensions contributions.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all the audience members. Yeah, we're being inundated with lots of great questions. So, one from Chris Gibson: is it likely that the Pensions Commission, which is about to review state pension age, will take account of the gender pensions gap? That might be quite hard to answer. Anyone know?
All I would say is I hope so. So I think a lot of people have put evidence before the government as to the fact that women are the majority of pensioners. So any examination of pensions effectively is examining the long-term financial outcomes for women.
Great.
And also as Anila said, the ONS launched this analysis of the gender wealth gap. They use a different and a specific measure, but I think it's a good sign that at least they are putting a number, so we can have we can understand the magnitude of the problem. I think that's a very necessary first step, and yeah, I also hope they take it into account.
Great. So we've got 5 more minutes and loads of questions. So sadly, we're not going to be able to get through them all. But we've got a question which is, wouldn't the cost of putting national insurance on rent income just be passed on to renters in the form of increased rent? Good question.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something that we are conscious of the risks of as well. So if this was, we would also want to see this alongside safeguards, so things like rent caps and freezes that would prevent that from happening, and other safeguards that can be taken in the design of the tax to hopefully ensure, because obviously we wouldn't want to see a situation where rent is going up even more. But this is just one example of the way in which national insurance could be applied to investment income. There are lots of other ways that people can make sort of passive income through investment that should ultimately be taxed in the same way and equally to the way in which we tax income from work. But it is an important point and something we'd want to ensure in any design that was prevented.
Thank you so much. And then we've got a question from Diane Elson. How do we deal with the arguments that taxing wealth will lead to lower economic growth and thus less for investing in public services, and the argument that the rich will be able to avoid wealth taxes?
I can come in again unless anyone else wants to. But yeah, thanks for highlighting these. These are definitely the two biggest challenges that we're up against. It's the taxes are bad for growth, wealth tax is bad for growth, and all the rich people will leave. On the growth point, we are working with, I mean, there is already a really significant amount of research out there that shows that inequality and wealth inequality is bad for growth. It doesn't help our country if more and more people are living in poverty. And this is true for many reasons, not least because of the fact that workforces need to be happy, healthy, supported in order for us to have a thriving economy. Public services need to be functioning in order for businesses to thrive. And on top of that, many of the reforms that we're calling for, including reforming capital gains tax and applying national insurance to investment income and taxing share buybacks, is another one. These are all found, researchers found that these would actually help growth because they encourage investment away from sort of passive assets into the real economy, which would drive productivity and economic growth. So there are key ways that we can sort of rebut this argument. And on the capital flight, I mean, it's really taken grip. The media has massively sensationalized this, but we, along with Tax Justice Network and Patriotic Millionaires, put out a piece of research that found that these media reports were completely baseless and sensationalized, like the so-called exodus of millionaires actually accounted for 0.3% of the UK's millionaires, which is the normal amount that would be moving anyway. And we know that people's main reasons for moving are not to do with tax and are in fact to do with family, business, where their social ties are. And the vast majority of UK millionaires want to stay in the UK, give back to the country that's given them so much, that is their home.
Thank you so much. Time, I think, for just one more question. So thank you. We've got one from Grace Mansa Owusu. Did the research touch on intersectionality as well, such as ethnicity, religion, sexuality?
No, this time we only looked at gender. Yeah, I think it would be very interesting to have an intersectional approach to wealth inequality. I'm not sure about if the data is or the database big enough to do those comparisons, but I know that Runnymede Trust has done some work about wealth and ethnicity, and that's very interesting. And if I'm correct, Resolution Foundation has also some information and work around that. But yeah, thank you, and definitely something to have in mind also for the hopefully next version of this report.
Great. I think actually we've got time for one more question, and it's quite a yeah, I think it's a good question to end with. So it's from Jackie Henley. Thank you, Jackie. I think it's probably best for Ignacia to answer this. Where is your report going? You know, are you going to discuss it with the Chancellor? Are you sharing it with MPs?
Yes, we are sharing it with MPs. We would love to discuss it with the Chancellor. I don't know if she will have time for us. But yeah, we have wonderful public affairs team that is working on getting this report out. And I also think it's our report is part of many moving pieces that are calling for taxation of wealth. So yeah, there's a big movement, and I think we're part of that. And it's very important to work together because there are many arguments in favor of wealth tax. We provide the gender aspect of it, and hopefully MPs will read our report and follow some of our recommendations.
Well, look, thank you to all the speakers. You've been brilliant. So yeah, we're going to head off now, but thanks everyone for joining, and yeah, have a good day. And yeah, you can obviously find the report on Women's Budget Group's website. All right, take care.